G'day there, this is Sarah from Amateur Filmies, and today I wanted to take you through the 5 scariest segments from horror anthologies. I wanted to preface this by saying that I'm by no means an expert on horror anthologies, but I have seen my fair share of them. Although I haven't seen some particular classics because of availability within my country, namely the Twilight Zone movie, so cannot wait to get my hands on that one and finally watch it. Most of you know that segments within an anthology film can really vary in quality. So while I am recommending some of these segments, I'm not necessarily recommending all these anthology movies because the entire movie itself might be pretty okay, pretty average, but these segments in particular are very strong. I'll be ranking these segments from sort of spooky to absolutely terrifying, and obviously this is my personal opinion and I'm by no means an authority on horror anthologies. So I'll be starting off with number 5, and number 5 is the gas station segment from the 90s horror Body Bags. It's directed by Tobe Hooper and John Carpenter. So the movie starts off with a young woman who's just started her first shift as a petrol station attendant. It's the graveyard shift, and she's working the same night that a serial killer has escaped from a mental institution in the town of Haddonfield, Illinois. Sound familiar? What makes this segment so memorable and so creepy is that we as an audience are meant to sort of question every single character and suspect them. This sort of fake out in the storyline is something that I'd first heard when my sister used to tell me urban legend stories, and those stories still creep me out to this day. An example of a good fake out is like a woman at a gas station in a car, a crazy man comes and yells at her and she locks the door and she drives away, only to realize that the man's yelling at her because there's a killer in the back seat. Body Bags as an anthology film was decent. I think the gas station segment was its strongest point, but overall, it doesn't really compare to films like Creepshow. However, I do recommend watching it if you are a lover of anthology and horrors. So number 4 is from an all-female directed horror anthology called XX or XX. I actually don't own a copy of it, but the segment in question is called The Box, and it's actually based on a short story by Jack Ketchum. The plotline to this segment is pretty simple. A young boy is traveling on a train with his mother, and he comes across an old man holding a gift box. The man allows the boy to look in the gift box, but from that point he refuses to eat. The mother becomes increasingly worried at her son's refusal to eat, and she tries everything to keep him sustained, but nothing is working. And I'll stop explaining the plot from there because I don't want to ruin anything, so I'll stop. There are many ways to interpret this segment, but it feels very nihilistic, and that is a very different type of horror compared to your straight up scares. The segment also plays on the fear of the unknown and the unseen, and the unseen can be a really powerful tool in cinema because it leaves the audience to sort of speculate on the horrors that lie within the box. While it is great to see a celebration of female horror directors, XX or XX is not a groundbreaking film. The other segments are pretty decent, but none of them quite compare to the thrills of The Box. The third segment on this list is probably the most famous, and that is Something to Tide You Over from the Creepshow movie. So the segment follows an eccentric millionaire, played by Leslie Nielsen, and he's getting revenge on his cheating wife and her boyfriend by burying them up to their necks in the sand and letting sort of the tide come in and drown them, all while he televises it and watches over in delight. But soon karma catches up with him, and the two lovers rise from the dead and exact their revenge. The amazing practical effects on this alone make it terrifyingly memorable, and it is such a good scare, but it also works as a beautiful metaphor for guilt. At least that's how I interpreted it, like what guilt can do to a person. This is one of the main horror stories I think of when I think of 80s horror. It's just a classic. And if you haven't seen Creepshow, which I'm sure most of you have, I highly recommend it. It's the perfect example of what a horror anthology should be. So number 2 is a segment from the film VHS 2, and that is A Ride in the Park. So this segment is filmed POV style from the perspective of a helmet camera of a cyclist that's going through the park. On his ride, the cyclist is attacked by a woman covered in blood, and he subsequently is killed. The rest of the segment is filmed from the perspective of the cyclist as a reanimated zombie and his interactions with humans. This is definitely not the first zombie film to be filmed from the zombie's point of view, but it's definitely the most effective because it is so chaotic and it's so visceral thanks to the amazing practical effects. I think the segment's length actually worked in its favour because it was very fast-paced, but it also didn't drag. And as a lot of you know, I'm a huge fan of zombie movies, and this one definitely didn't disappoint. I know a lot of you have probably already seen the VHS films. I personally find the second one to be better in general. The segments feel stronger to me personally, but both of them are modern anthologies that every horror lover needs to watch. So the scariest segment from a horror anthology for me personally is the third and final story from Ghost Stories by Andy Nyman and Jeremy Dyson. The anthology itself follows a paranormal skeptic who aims to debunk 3 chilling tales of the supernatural. So the third segment has the skeptic interviewer banker who has a pregnant wife who has fallen ill, and his house is being haunted by a poltergeist. The segment itself is pretty short, and it involves the banker walking around his house, and he is visited by the rageful ghost of a familiar woman. He later learns of a tragic event that's occurred in his family, and the segment culminates in a dark and shocking end. The plotline to this segment is very simple, but it works within the tapestry and the lore of the entire film to create a sense of unease and dread. The segment itself obviously works well on its own, but it works even better when you consider the entire film and the themes of loss and grief that it explores. This is definitely the anthology horror I most highly recommend on this list because the segments and the entire film itself is really compelling. That being said, I wasn't the biggest fan of the end of this film. I realized that it sort of gave everything a bit of a meaning, but it almost felt like it negated the rest of the film. So that concludes my video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know if you guys have any recommendations for anthology horrors or any segments in particular. And also let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my choices. I'm very curious to find out what you guys think. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to Amateur Filmies. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.